What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christoforou with the Duran, and I'm here with Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, Alexander Mercouris. And today we're going to be talking about Angela Merkel and the mini EU summit. Alexander, we as I said in my intro, we had a mini EU summit. It wasn't a full-on, all the hoopla, everyone, every country, in Brussels to discuss various topics. It was a gathering of about 15 countries, and it was pretty much one topic, and that topic was immigration. And I'd like to say that there's three players right now in the thick of it. Obviously, Angela Merkel, Germany, Macron in France, and Italy. And I think Italy's a big disruptor. So can you give us some background about the EU summit and about these three players and how they're interlocked in what the summit was about, essentially?
Right, I think the person, first of all, who called this summit is Angela Merkel, and she called it, to be absolutely clear, for domestic political reasons. We recently discussed this in a video together, a discussion we had when we spoke about the political crisis that's now emerging in Germany as Horst Seehofer and the Christian Social Union Party of Bavaria, a critical coalition partner for Merkel, are now saying that they want to take decisive action to sort out the immigration crisis that is afflicting not just Germany, but all of Europe, but also especially Germany. Seehofer, who is the interior minister, he wants to put border guards on German territory to turn back refugees and migrants who try to come to Germany, even if they come from elsewhere in the EU. Merkel didn't want to do that. Her Social Democratic Party, a coalition partner, regards that with horror. So she was given 2 weeks by Seehofer to come up with a solution at the EU level. And if she didn't, he threatened to go ahead with his plan without her, which would provoke a political crisis in Germany and perhaps the collapse of the coalition and quite possibly the fall of Merkel herself. So she called this summit at very short notice before the proper European Council meeting in next week in order to come up with an agreement there. Now, against her, pitted against her, you have the new Italian government, which we have also talked about at length in previous discussions on this channel. And of course, they came to power very much as the anti-immigration parties in Italy who were going to cope with the flow of immigrants that have been pouring into Italy from North Africa and other places. And the Italians feel very strongly that, first of all, this shouldn't be happening. Secondly, it was Merkel who, in effect, invited them to Europe by talking back in 2015 about how Europe's and Germany's doors were open to these people. And thirdly, that the Germans and the others are not taking their fair share of these people who are not being distributed throughout the EU fairly or appropriately. Then you're absolutely correct. There is the other big player who is President Macron of France. He wants to pursue a very strong integrationist policy. He wants to have everything centralized at an EU level. And he is trying to develop some kind of partnership arrangement with the Germans and with Merkel specifically. So on the one hand, he wants to help Merkel. On the other hand, he also understands that if he's going to pursue any kind of successful EU policy, and in order to balance the Germans, who would be becoming too strong otherwise, he needs to be on good terms with Italy. So he had recently a meeting with the Italian Prime Minister Conti, who is the leader of this new government, and they appeared to come to some sort of understanding that there would have to be some movement on migration issues. Now, what came out of this summit, however, to the, I think, extreme disappointment of Merkel, is that no real agreement was achieved at all. And the reason no real agreement was achieved was because her ideas and those of the Italians were in direct conflict with each other. The Italians want Europe to close the doors to refugees and migrants. Merkel still wants to keep them open. The Italians want to redistribute migrants and refugees in Italy to other European countries. That is, of course, exactly what the Germans don't want. The Italians want to pursue a more national-sided policy, one decided by the individual states. Merkel and Macron obviously also still want things decided at EU level. So the result was no movement, no agreement at this summit at all, putting Merkel's position in great jeopardy.
As you said, one of the agreements for Italy, one of the proposals that they made was that if you're not going to take migrants as an EU country, then obviously your funding should get cut. And if you are going to take migrants, then you should get a bulk of the EU funding. Explain that a little to us and delve into a little bit for our viewers about the Schengen system that the EU uses and how those funds are currently distributed and what what Italy's proposal was to Angela Merkel and to those people at the summit.
Yeah. I mean, I think one should make that very clear, first of all, that that is an incendiary proposal. And we haven't talked about a group of countries that did not attend the summit. This is the so-called Visegrad group. These are the Central European states of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the rest, who have very strong anti-immigrant governments, who are adamantly opposed to taking any refugees or migrants at all. So they would look upon with total horror any proposal such as the one that Italy made. Now, let us go back a bit to talk about Schengen. Schengen is an agreement that was reached by the EU. Doesn't cover every country. Britain, for example, is outside it. But basically, it means a no-border Europe. It means that people can move around the EU once they are inside the EU, once they are within this group of countries which form the bulk of the EU, they can move around without basically having to worry about border controls or passport controls or such things. I recently had to take a trip to Germany. I did it through France and Belgium and into Germany and out again, and I did it by car. And at no point in time did I have to stop at a border control check. That is the Schengen Agreement. Now, all these proposals that we're hearing, Zerohedge's proposal in Germany to put border guards on German territory to turn back migrants, that would effectively be the end of Schengen. If the Italians, what the Italians are proposing, though it would in some ways protect Schengen, by decanting people who arrive in Italy to other EU countries and threatening to cut their funding if they don't accept them, that is going to run into huge opposition from the Visegrad group that I was talking about. Because though these are countries that receive a huge amount of funding from the EU, proportionately, I believe Poland gets the most of any EU state. They are adamantly opposed to accepting migrants. So that would, in effect, put them in a very difficult position politically and economically, where they would risk losing their funding if they turned these migrants down, and they are determined to turn these migrants down. So that's an incendiary proposal, one which is certain to be resisted by many people. Can I say, because I come back to the point that you made right at the start, I think the Italians know it is unacceptable and they are deliberately creating trouble and being wreckers in this scenario. Because I think that the new Italian government, which we discussed previously, is extremely unhappy about the integrationist positions that the EU has been taking. And I think what they want to do is that they want to slowly unpack that integrationist logic that the EU has been following for a long time and repatriate controls back to the individual member states. If you look at people like Salvini, who are now leading the government in Italy, quite clearly that is what he wants. So I think that the Italians pitched this very carefully. They knew that they would be making a demand which Merkel couldn't reject outright, but she can't accept it either. So it was extremely cleverly done. It meant that they didn't come away from the summit being blamed by everybody for wrecking it, but that's essentially what happened, leaving, as we said, Merkel herself in an extremely difficult position. If
that's Italy's plan, doesn't that also go against Macron's plan to create a more integrated federal United States of Europe, so to speak? Isn't that where Macron is trying to push Europe?
That is exactly where Macron is trying to push Europe. I mean, his whole policy is, as he puts it, more Europe. I mean, he is the person who is now almost alone amongst the big EU leaders. He is still pushing this EU integrationist, EU superstate policy that is being rejected everywhere. It's been rejected in Italy, as we saw. It's been rejected in Austria, emphatically. It's deeply unpopular in Poland and Hungary and the other Visegrad states. And it's been questioned increasingly in Germany too, with the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland there. They are strongly opposed to this policy, and with Horst Seehofer and the CSU opposing it also. And Merkel herself trying to keep the balance between Macron on the one hand and all of these rejectionists, and finding it increasingly difficult. Frankly, I think Macron, as in so much else, is being completely delusional. I think he simply doesn't understand, or hasn't yet understood, that this moment, the great integrationist moment that seemed to happen in Europe, is gone, and that we are, in effect, throughout Europe, moving away from this. And I think that he is actually isolating himself and France.
Yeah, well, Macron to me reminds me, he's like a young globalist, and he came to power a little bit too late. He would have fit in much better with Obama, Cameron, Merkel, that group, than where he is now. But what you have here is and to close it out, to close discussion out, it's interesting that you have in the U.S., you have a migrant issue, and now you have Trump, who's pushing back against the previous migrant policy that was implemented, and he's looking to clean up the migrant problems that the U.S. has. And you also have Europe, which has obviously a migrant problem and a migrant issue. But in this case, you have Angela Merkel, and it's almost like she's doubling down. She refuses to give an inch on anything but open borders, even though everything is screaming to her. The votes in various countries, the public, her own citizens, even other EU colleagues and other EU members are saying the same thing. It has to stop. We have to reform something. So my question is actually really simple. Why is Angela Merkel so insistent on this open borders policy? How come she just doesn't sit down and negotiate the thing in order to save her skin, in order to save Europe? I mean, what does she gain out of this?
Well, I think before we discuss her own issues, which are really very complicated, that we must always bear in mind that she leads a coalition government. And of course, her other big coalition partner, which is the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, is completely ideologically committed to this policy. I mean, they would resist, I think, very strongly any attempt to row back on these policies, at least for the moment. They're doing so, however, even though these policies are proving massively unpopular with their own working class electoral base, and their support is collapsing. So, I mean, it's very strange when we talk about Merkel being her pig-headedness, essentially. The SPD's pig-headedness on this issue is also baffling. Now, as for Merkel herself, it's very difficult sometimes to understand Angela Merkel. I mean, she is not for nothing sometimes spoken of as a sphinx. Why she insists on this extraordinary policy, it's not always easy to understand. But I have a feeling that deep down, inside herself, what it all comes down to with Merkel is a question of power. What Merkel basically wants is an EU controlled from the centre, with herself in Berlin as in effect in control of it. What this immigration policy, this anti-immigration policy that is being talked about across the EU is essentially saying is we have to move away from that. We have to have situations where EU states themselves start making these decisions by themselves. Because let's be very clear about this. The EU does not itself have an army, a customs force, a border control force. These are national things. These are things that the nations that make up the EU have. So she doesn't want to give away control away from herself and the central EU institutions to these states, because I think she thinks that if that starts to happen on one issue, then slowly, the whole EU structure will start to unravel. And that is why she is being so obstinate about this. She has the politics in Germany, which make it difficult for her to retreat. But I think she also has this perception that if she starts to give on this issue, she'll have to start give on more issues, and the EU federal system, we could almost call it that, will start to break down. And she herself quite clearly is very committed to preserving that system because it is essential to her own power. So I think that's probably what we're looking at here. We also have to bear in mind that we have a politician who took an extraordinary decision back in 2015 to open the doors, closing them down. It'd be a tremendous admission of failure, and no politician ever likes to do that. So there may be a pride issue as well. But I think that is less important than the other two that I've just said.
All right, so my final question would be Italy, France, Germany. Who wins in the end as far as a migrant policy goes?
Well, I think in time, on this migrant policy, I think it's got to be Italy. And for the reason that you've just said previously, everybody is shouting about this. There comes a point where even a political leader as deeply entrenched as Merkel is, or even a political leader as deluded as Macron is, has to bend to reality. You can't withstand this tide forever. And can I just say, I think this is now, a line has been crossed on this issue. I don't think there's any going back. I don't think you're ever going to get Italians or Spanish or Greek voters not to be concerned about this issue. I think that any idea that we're going to go back to the world as it was before 2015 can be completely abandoned. So I think Italy will win on this issue. But you are absolutely right in your previous question to point to the difference with Donald Trump. Because in the United States, you have a clear chain of command. You have a president, Donald Trump, who is accountable to the American people and who is in charge and who can make decisions. Now, those decisions may be resisted, partly by the bureaucracy, by Congress, by the courts, but there is nonetheless a clear hierarchy, a clear decision-making structure. In Europe, there is nothing like that. What we have is a totally dysfunctional system where everybody is in conflict with everybody. And Italy may win on this issue, but it's not guaranteed to win on anything else. And in fact, nobody ever is. So we're going to go from one botch and crisis to another botch and crisis. And that looks to me to be the pattern now.
The more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess, in Europe.
Exactly. I mean, that puts it exactly right. And if you look at the system that's been created, I mean, it's almost the stuff of nightmares, actually. And I think some of the people who go on and talk about the EU as this great institution which we need to preserve need to be realistic about this and look at what it is now. I mean, it is not working, and it's difficult to see how it ever can work.
Yeah, I think as Greeks and people that go to Greece often and have lived through it, I think we have a we have a clear understanding of what you just said, that the EU is definitely not working. That's for sure.
No, absolutely.
All right, well, we'll see where this goes. There's no doubt that Angela Merkel is fighting for her political life. I think that's becoming increasingly more obvious. Alexander Mercouris, absolutely. Alexander Mercouris, thanks you once again for a great analysis as to what happened in Brussels the other day. If you like this video, guys, click on the subscribe button down below. Also, click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. And please visit the Duran shop, buy a shirt, help support the Duran. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Until next time, guys, take care.